The dust of the Old West carried more than the scent of cattle and gunpowder. It carried secrets buried deep in the hearts of men. And on one fateful evening, when the ranch house lamps flickered against the darkening sky, those secrets came crashing to the surface. The son, once cast out and left to wander the unforgiving frontier, had returned. His boots echoed across the wooden floorboards as he sat at his father's table. No longer the boy who had been rejected, but a man hardened by exile and silence. What unfolded at that dinner would shatter more than a family bond. It would tear open a wound the entire valley had tried to forget. The father, a rancher known for his iron will and unyielding pride, welcomed his son with measured words and a guarded stare. For years, he had buried his past beneath the weight of the land, hoping the world would never know the truth he carried. To the outside, he was a man respected, even feared, the kind whose name carried weight in every saloon and courthouse. But to his son, who bore the scars of abandonment, he was nothing more than a coward hiding behind a facade. And that night, the son had come not to reconcile, but to reveal. The table was set with the simplicity of the West: bread, stew, and the silence of two men who had more history between them than either wished to acknowledge. The ranch hands lingered outside, sensing the storm that brewed within those walls. The son's gaze was sharp, cutting through the shadows as he studied the man who had once turned him away. There was no trembling in his voice, no hesitation in his posture. He had come armed not with guns, but with truth, and the truth was far deadlier. As the first words left his lips, the air grew heavy. He spoke of nights he had endured hunger, of days when the desert sun beat down on him without mercy, of years spent carving a life from nothing but rage and survival. Yet, woven into his story was the darker revelation he carried, one that could destroy his father's name, his ranch, and the respect he had built. It was a truth whispered in the alleys of distant towns, pieced together from fragments of lies and confessions. Now, spoken aloud, it would become impossible to deny. The father's hand froze on the spoon before him. The weight of the words had struck like a bullet, steady and deliberate. The son leaned closer, his voice low but unwavering, and revealed the secret that would unravel everything his father had spent a lifetime building. It was not just a confession, it was an execution, carried out at the dinner table. And in that moment, the rancher's darkest secret became a weapon, one that his own flesh and blood had chosen to wield. The room grew unbearably quiet after the son's words cut through the air. The crackle of the fire in the hearth seemed louder than ever, its flames throwing restless shadows across the walls. The rancher, a man who had faced stampedes, droughts, and rival gunmen without flinching, now found himself frozen before his own flesh and blood. His eyes betrayed something rare, not anger, not pride, but fear. It was the fear of a man who realized that the past he had buried so carefully had clawed its way back to the surface. The son leaned back in his chair, his posture calm yet defiant, as though he had waited years for this moment. His words were not rushed, not shouted. They were deliberate, each one delivered like the swing of a hammer against stone. He spoke of the shame his father had hidden, of the night he had abandoned not only a boy, but also a responsibility that could not be erased. Every sentence carried the weight of betrayal. Every pause dared his father to deny it. The rancher's hand trembled slightly as it rested on the table. For the first time in his life, power had slipped from his grasp. He had built an empire of respect, his name whispered with admiration in the town, his authority unchallenged across miles of land. But now none of that mattered. Here, inside the walls of his own home, he was not the master of a ranch, but a father confronted by the son he had wronged. Outside, the ranch hands shifted uneasily, hearing only fragments through the thin wooden walls. They could not make out the words, but they recognized the tone. Something sacred was being broken inside that house, something no amount of mended fences or cattle counts could repair. And they waited, knowing that when morning came, the valley itself would feel the weight of whatever had been spoken that night. The teacher, the rancher's wife, sat silently at the table, her heart racing as she listened. She had never known the full extent of her husband's past, never asked too deeply, content to live in the present. But now, As she watched the pain carve lines deeper into his face, she understood that this secret was not only about the boy and his father. It was about the entire foundation of the ranch, about the legacy she herself had stepped into. And the truth was unraveling before her eyes. The son's gaze did not waver. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, carried both the fury of rejection and the satisfaction of revelation. He spoke of years wandering the plains, of nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness pressed against his chest. Yet in every word there was strength, the kind of strength born not from privilege, but from survival. His life had been carved out of dust and pain, and now he returned not as a beggar seeking his place, but as a man demanding justice. The rancher finally found his voice, though it was weaker than he intended. He tried to deny, to argue, to twist the story into something more palatable. But the son cut him off with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in silence. He laid bare the details, names, dates, moments too specific to dismiss. With each revelation, the rancher's defenses crumbled, leaving him exposed before his family, his men, and himself. The teacher's hands clenched around the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she fought to process the storm unraveling around her. The man she had married, the one she had believed stood on unshakable ground, now appeared fragile, fallible. She glanced between father and son, torn between loyalty to the man who had given her shelter and compassion for the boy who bore the scars of abandonment. In that moment, she realized she could not remain a silent witness. This was more than a family quarrel. It was a reckoning. The rancher's silence grew heavier with each passing second. Pride, his oldest companion, no longer served him. He lowered his gaze, and for the first time, the son saw not the figure of dominance who had cast him out, but a man weighed down by regret. The power shifted across the table, flowing into the hands of the one who had once been powerless. And in that shift, the room felt charged, as though even the walls leaned in to hear what would come next. Finally, the son leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You always taught others to fear you," he said, his words cutting sharper than any blade. "But tonight, you will learn what it means to be seen for what you truly are." And with those words, the rancher's secret ceased to be a shadow whispered in silence. It became truth, undeniable and unescapable, shaping the fate of everyone who sat at that table. The firelight flickered against the son's face, making him appear older than his years, as though the desert itself had carved him from stone. He did not gloat, nor did he shout. His vengeance was not found in anger, but in truth, wielded with precision. The rancher shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his breath heavy, as though every word from his son pressed against his chest like the weight of a mountain. For a man who had commanded the respect of cowboys and townsfolk alike, to be cornered by his own blood was a punishment no outlaw could have devised. The teacher broke the silence with a trembling voice. She asked the question that lingered in everyone's mind. Why? Why had the rancher turned away his own flesh? Why had he condemned his son to a life of exile? The answer did not come easily. His lips parted, then closed again, his pride wrestling with the truth he had hidden for so long. Finally, with a voice ragged and low, he confessed. His rejection had not been born of hate, but of fear. Fear that the mistakes of his past would ruin the legacy he had fought so hard to build. The son's jaw tightened to the words. Fear. That single word had been the reason for his suffering, the justification for years of loneliness, hunger, and rage. The teacher's heart ached as she looked upon them both, father and son, bound by blood, yet separated by choices that could not be undone. She saw in the rancher's eyes a glimmer of regret, but also the stubborn pride of a man too late in realizing the cost of his decisions. The ranch hands, now gathered just beyond the doorway, exchanged uneasy glances. They had served the rancher for years, their loyalty unquestioned, but this revelation was not something that could be ignored. The man they had admired stood stripped of his iron facade, revealed as flawed and broken. And in that moment, the son, once a shadow on the edges of their lives, seemed to embody the raw honesty that the rancher had lost. The tension thickened, the room heavy with the weight of confession and betrayal. The son leaned closer, his voice carrying not only accusation, but also a bitter plea. You feared losing the ranch, he said, his words sharp as a blade. But in doing so, you lost me. The statement hung in the air, undeniable, unforgettable, a verdict that echoed louder than any gunshot on the frontier. The rancher bowed his head, the first gesture of surrender his son had ever witnessed. His hands, once steady and commanding, trembled as he pressed them against the worn wood of the table. The fire in his eyes dimmed, not extinguished by defiance, but by the crushing weight of truth. For the first time, the son saw not the rancher who had banished him, but a man haunted by the choices that had defined his life. The mighty had fallen, and it was not to bullets or disease, but to his own conscience. The teacher, torn between the two, felt her role shift. She was no longer simply a bystander. She had become the keeper of this truth, a witness to the unraveling of a legacy. She wanted to reach for her husband's hand, to offer comfort, but the son's presence stopped her. To comfort the father was to deny the son's pain, and she knew that silence would wound more than words. So, she stayed still, caught in the storm, her heart breaking for them both. The son's eyes softened for the briefest moment. Beneath the bitterness and the fury, there was a child's yearning, long buried but never silenced. He did not want to destroy his father entirely. What he wanted was acknowledgement, a confession that he had mattered all along. His voice quivered as he demanded it. Not wealth, not land, but the truth. Say it, he whispered. Say I was yours. The rancher lifted his gaze, his face etched with defeat. The pride that had kept him silent for decades cracked, and tears welled in eyes that had seen wars, death, and hardship without flinching. His voice broke as he finally spoke the words he had once refused. You are my son, he admitted, his tone both a confession and a surrender. And I have wronged you more than I can ever repay. The confession struck harder than any of the accusations before. The son's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of his rage had at last found release. The teacher felt tears stream down her face, her heart overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. In the silence that followed, the air seemed to shift, as though the land itself had paused to witness a truth too powerful to be ignored. The room felt strangely lighter after the words were spoken, yet the relief was not without pain. The son sat back, his chest heaving as if he had run a great distance, though he had not moved an inch. For years, he had imagined this moment, sometimes with anger, sometimes with sorrow, but never had he thought it would come with tears in his father's eyes. The man he had once seen as untouchable now sat before him, stripped of all armor, exposed in the rawness of regret. The teacher finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked at the two men across the table and realized the enormity of what had just transpired. The truth, though jagged and cruel, had broken through walls that had stood for decades. It had cost them dearly, but it had also laid the foundation for something new, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniably real. In the Old West, where men often settled disputes with bullets, here was a battle fought with words, each one cutting deeper than steel. Outside, the ranch hands lowered their heads, as though they too felt the weight of the confession. Their loyalty had always been to the ranch, to the name of the man who led them, but now they saw the cost of that name. Some pitied him, others judged him, but all of them understood that the ranch would never be the same. Word would spread, as it always did, and the secret would no longer be his alone. The son's voice, steadier now, carried not hatred but something unexpected, longing. He spoke of the years he had survived alone, of the hunger that had shaped him, of the nights when the cold wind had been his only companion. Yet, beneath it all, what he had always craved was acknowledgement. Not riches, not cattle, not even the land. He had wanted his father's eyes to see him, to claim him, to say aloud what he had once denied. And tonight, at long last, he had received it. The rancher's shoulders slumped, his strength fading like the dying flames in the hearth. He whispered that no legacy, no ranch, no reputation was worth the loss of his son. His pride had been his fortress, but it had also been his prison. Now, freed from it, he was left with nothing but the hope that it was not too late. The teacher's heart ached at his words, knowing that redemption in the West was always uncertain. But she also knew that confessions had the power to reshape even the hardest of destinies. Dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, as though the earth itself bore witness to the storm that had passed. The sun had not slept. He sat on the porch, watching the light crawl across the plains, his thoughts as restless as the wind. The rancher, weary and fragile, remained inside, his body weakened by age and his spirit heavy with the weight of truth. The teacher moved quietly between them, torn between the hope of reconciliation and the fear of what might come next. When the rancher stepped outside, his steps slow, his presence was not one of authority, but of humility. For the first time in many years, he addressed his son not as an intruder or an enemy, but as kin. He offered no excuses, no defenses, only a simple plea, that his son stay, not for the land or for the legacy, but for the chance to rebuild what had been lost. The words trembled in the morning air, fragile as glass, yet powerful enough to stir something deep within his son's heart. The son's reply came with hesitation, his voice steady but edged with caution. He admitted that staying would not erase the scars of the past, nor silence the nights of hunger and loneliness. Forgiveness, if it was to come, would not be immediate. Yet, he acknowledged the truth of what he had seen in his father's eyes. Not pride, not defiance, but sorrow. And sorrow, though painful, was the beginning of something different, understanding. The teacher listened from the doorway, her eyes glistening with tears she did not try to hide. She saw before her the fragile beginnings of reconciliation, not the sweeping kind found in fairy tales, but the slow, grueling kind forged through honesty and pain. She knew the road ahead would be long, perhaps too long for either man to walk fully. Yet in that moment, she also knew that something had shifted. The silence that had once divided them had been broken. As the sun rose higher, casting its light across the land, the ranch seemed to breathe anew. The cattle stirred, the horses whinnied, and life went on as it always did in the West. But for the father and the son, nothing would ever be the same. A secret once buried had come to light, and with it came the possibility, fragile, uncertain, but real, that even in the harshest of lands, broken bonds could be mended. The days that followed carried a different weight across the ranch. Where silence once served as a wall between father and son, it now lingered like a fragile bridge. Meals were no longer filled with the sound of accusations, but neither were they comfortable. Each glance exchanged across the table was a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be rebuilt. The teacher, ever observant, moved carefully between them, offering words when needed and silence when it mattered most. The ranch hands, too, sensed the change. They worked the cattle and repaired the fences, yet their eyes often drifted toward the porch where the father and son now sat together at dusk. Few words passed between them, but the sight alone was enough to spark whispers in town. Some said the son had returned to claim the land. Others swore he had come only to see his father broken. But those who had stood close enough knew the truth. What had begun in bitterness was slowly transforming into something else. The son carried himself with a mixture of pride and restraint. Though he bore the anger of years lost, he also found himself strangely drawn to the ranch he had once despised. The open fields, the sound of horses at dawn, the scent of leather and hay, they stirred something within him, a reminder that this land was not only his father's legacy, but his own blood as well. He resisted at first, but the pull of belonging was stronger than he expected. The rancher, meanwhile, seemed to age rapidly before their eyes. His strength waned with each passing day, though he rarely admitted it aloud. The son noticed the tremor in his hands when he saddled a horse, the way his breath shortened after only a short walk across the yard. And though part of him wanted to dismiss it, another part, the part still bound by blood, could not ignore it. For all his resentment, he could not watch his father fade without feeling the sting of loss. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of fire, the father spoke words the son had never expected. "This ranch was never meant to be my monument," he said, his voice low and weary. "It was meant to be a home, yours as much as mine." The admission struck like thunder, echoing across the land. For the first time, the son realized that his father was no longer fighting to preserve pride or power. He was fighting only for time to pass the torch before it was too late. That night, the son could not sleep. He walked the perimeter of the ranch beneath the moonlight, his boots pressing into the familiar soil. Every post, every corral, every blade of grass seemed to whisper the weight of his father's legacy. He had once cursed this place, swearing never to return, yet now he found himself imagining what it would mean to stay. The conflict raged within him. The boy who had been rejected demanded revenge, but the man he had become longed for something else, belonging. The teacher found him at dawn, leaning against the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. She spoke softly, reminding him that pain and pride had destroyed many families in the West. But truth, even painful truth, had the power to rebuild what seemed impossible. Her words carried the wisdom of one who had seen both loss and redemption. And though the son said little, he listened. Her presence, calm and steady, was the anchor he did not know he needed. Inside the house, the rancher lay awake, his body failing faster than his spirit. He had confessed his darkest secret, faced the son he had wronged, and shed the pride that had once defined him. Yet one fear remained, that his time would run out before he could heal the rift completely. Each day felt like borrowed time, each sunrise a reminder that he could not hold on forever. His final hope rested not on his strength, but on whether his son would choose to carry what he could not. The following evening, the son sat once more at the dinner table. The same table where secrets had been exposed now served as the place of hesitant beginnings. He spoke little, but his actions spoke louder. He repaired a broken hinge on the barn, helped mend a section of fence, and rode alongside the hands as they drove the cattle. Each task was small, but each one was a step closer to claiming the place he had once been denied. The teacher watched this transformation with a quiet awe. She saw in the son the same fire that had once burned in the rancher's youth, tempered by the hardships of exile. She realized that what had begun as a night of confrontation was slowly shaping into something greater, the restoration of a legacy not of land alone, but of family. Yet she also knew that the frontier gave no guarantees. Rebuilding trust was a journey far more dangerous than any trail, and only time would reveal if father and son could truly endure it. The rancher's health grew more fragile with each sunrise. His once powerful frame, built from decades of toil under the unforgiving sun, now seemed hollow, as though the land itself was slowly reclaiming him. He spent more time on the porch than in the saddle, watching the son take on tasks that had once been his alone. Pride flickered in his eyes, mixed with regret, for every action the boy performed reminded him of years that could never be regained. The son, though still carrying the sting of abandonment, could not deny the bond that grew in the silence of their shared work. He saw his father not as an untouchable figure of authority, but as a man stripped of strength, clinging to what little time remained. Each word they exchanged, no matter how brief, became precious. Sometimes it was about the cattle, sometimes about the weather, and sometimes, rarely, about the past. Those rare moments carried more weight than all the rancher's years of command. The teacher, ever the steady presence, became the thread holding them together. She cooked their meals, soothed their tempers, and spoke the words neither father nor son could. To her, this was not merely about a ranch or legacy, but about healing a wound that stretched across 2 generations. She saw the boy's longing for belonging and the father's desperate need for forgiveness, and she knew both still walked a fragile line between reconciliation and collapse. The town, meanwhile, watched with sharp eyes. Whispers spread through the saloons and markets. Some claimed the boy had returned to inherit what was rightfully his. Others muttered that he would only bring ruin. Yet none could deny the change on the ranch. Where once there had been silence, now there was the sound of hammers, the rhythm of hooves, and the faint hope of a future rising from the ashes of betrayal. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, the rancher called his son to his side. His voice was weak, yet steady with conviction. "The land will survive me," he said, his hand gripping the boy's forearm with surprising strength. "But it will not survive if you carry only bitterness. It must be tended with love, or it will consume you as it consumed me." The words struck the son deeply, for they carried not command but plea, a dying man's attempt to pass on more than land, but wisdom carved from years of regret. The final days came swiftly, as they often did in the West. The rancher's strength faded like the last embers of a fire, leaving him a shadow of the man he once was. Yet in those fading hours, something remarkable happened. The son, who had once sworn never to forgive, remained at his side. He tended to his father, not with eagerness, but with a quiet determination that spoke louder than words. Every act of care became a bridge over the chasm of their past. The teacher sat with them, her presence steady as the prairie winds. She read aloud from the Bible in the evenings, her voice carrying verses that spoke of redemption, mercy, and the fragile nature of time. Though the rancher rarely responded, his eyes softened as he listened, and sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, a tear would trace down his weathered cheek. The son, though silent, felt those words burn within him, reshaping the bitterness he had carried for so long. On a quiet morning, with the valley bathed in golden light, the rancher spoke his last. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime. He confessed again his failures, asked for forgiveness once more, and then, with a trembling hand, placed the ranch's future in his son's keeping. "Make it yours," he said, "but make it better than I ever did." Moments later, his breath faded, leaving only silence and the heavy responsibility of his final request. The burial beneath the old oak tree drew the town together. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity, but all bore witness to the closing of a chapter that had shaped the valley for decades. The son stood tall, no longer the rejected child, but the heir of both his father's legacy and his mistakes. The teacher stood beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm, a reminder that he was no longer alone. As the last shovelfuls of earth fell over the grave, the son looked across the land that stretched endlessly before him. It was no longer just a reminder of pain, but a promise, a chance to carve something new from the ruins of the past. And though the West was unforgiving, he now carried both the truth and the strength to face it. The darkest secret had been spoken, and in its shadow, the possibility of redemption was born. The story of the rejected son and his father's darkest secret is not merely a tale of betrayal and confession. It is a reminder of the fragile threads that bind us. In the Old West, where men were measured by their pride in their land, one man discovered too late that neither cattle nor fences could ever replace the bond of family. And in the end, it was not bullets or storms that brought him to his knees, but the truth spoken at his own table. The son's return was not an act of vengeance alone. It was a test of whether blood could survive the weight of years, and whether forgiveness could grow in soil long hardened by pride. By daring to confront his father, he forced open the wounds of silence and revealed that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with guns, but with honesty. His voice, once silenced, became the instrument of change, carving a path that words of denial never could. The father's downfall was also his redemption. He learned that to admit weakness was not to lose respect, but to finally earn it from the one he had wronged most. His confession, though late, carried more weight than a lifetime of silence. It proved that even the proudest of men cannot outrun their past, but they can choose, in their final hours, to face it. And in doing so, he left behind not just land, but a legacy reshaped by truth. For the teacher, who stood as both witness and anchor, this story revealed another lesson: that love and loyalty are not measured in what we inherit, but in what we choose to carry forward. She became the bridge between two broken souls, showing that healing often comes through the courage of those who refuse to turn away from pain. Through her, we see that redemption is never a solitary act, but a shared journey. And so, as the dust of the frontier settles on this tale, the question lingers for us all: what secrets still remain buried in our own lives, waiting to be spoken? What legacies are we building? Ones of silence or ones of truth? If this story moved you, let its echo live on. Share your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like to keep these voices alive, and subscribe to the channel to journey with us through more stories that pierce the heart and stir the soul. For in remembering, we keep the frontier's lessons alive, lessons that still speak to us today.